Okay, folks, it's about 1 a.m. I'm on the way home. I just wanted to go ahead and do a review of The Shadow Rising. Obviously, spoilers. And this is a review of The Shadow Rising from somebody who's read the whole series. So, spoilers for you for the entire Wheel of Time series, potentially. And we'll also talk a bit about the show. And as is my thing, I like to talk about the foreshadowing and the writing concepts and some of the show concepts that might derive from it. So, Darth bringing you another one right here. Alright, getting into The Shadow Rising. It has, right off the bat, something I want to talk about. A lot of series don't have a strict plan for where they are headed and what stakes they're going to create along the way. And what happens, you end up with this you end up with this weird threat rising action type thing in a book series where new concepts get introduced because a good writer knows that they need to introduce things that keep the series fresh. And unfortunately, as a consequence of that, the new threats that rise and are introduced make the old ones seem obsolete and tank their effectiveness, right? So as everything gets scaled up, just dodged a possum on that one. As everything gets scaled up, sometimes your enemies become less relevant. I think about Dark and Raw, if you've read the Sword of Truth series, as a great example of that. Dragon Ball Z does that a lot, right? Like, Frieza's just always going to be defeated at this point. He's kind of a punching bag, and at least up until that whole Super Saiyan God series with his golden form, that kind of thing. So you don't want to do that in a book series. And Robert Jordan did something fantastic. He didn't need to create a more advanced version of Trolloc. He didn't need to create, you've got your orcs and then you've got Uruk-hai. And Uruk-hai are fine in The Lord of the Rings, don't get me wrong. They're an example of this concept done well, because they're still just regular orcs, but an elite fighting force of them. And he kind of starts out there. Though I suppose goblins to orcs is an example that occurs between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but not particularly a bad one. There's a really great explanation for why orcs exist and are different, and Uruk-hai from them even. So I think that's an example of that sort of thing done well. I think that Horcruxes popping up in Harry Potter is an example of it done okay-ish, right? Could be better. Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time does not suffer from this at all, because he goes and he introduces two things, and he does an exceptional job of it. He introduces characters, the Forsaken, and he introduces them early on in the series. I mean, it's book one, but as we're exploring more and more of them, it's easy to question, wait a second, why didn't these guys all go turn Emond's Field into glass? And you find out that the ones who aren't in the know that they can't do that are waking up later than some of the other ones, and they are taking positions of power and taking sort of a longer game which is a great hint at things to come, and sets up a lot of future action. And then you find out that sometimes they're scheming against each other and not working together, so it's not really a faction that is unified. And then you get to find out that sometimes the Dark One will directly send them orders that countermand one another, and he'll pit them against each other artificially, and they might not even know about that. And that's fantastic. So that's one of the things Robert Jordan does to up the stakes here, without it feeling forced at all. Another thing that he does is he introduces bubbles of evil. And I think that bubbles of evil, especially for a first-time reader, just click. They just make perfect sense in this universe. The explanation for them is great, you know. It is, hey, the pattern is woven together in the way that we've taught you for 3 books now. In the 4th book, we're going to let you know that as the Dark One gets freer, I should say, he might have some impact on the pattern, and it'll be a little sort of taste of what it would be like if he were completely let loose. And those events aren't really controlled, they're just naturally occurring by his presence, almost like a living nightmare, which again makes sense because Tel'aran'rhiod is the world of dreams, and we know that all of the worlds are shades and or reflections of one another, including Tel'aran'rhiod, which connects all of them, right? So if reality is a sort of dream, which the Aiel believe it to be, it makes sense that it might sometimes not function perfectly. Robert Jordan is very big on the difference between what you perceive and what is. So he does a lot with that in the series. And, you know, just tying in that our ta'veren might naturally draw those bubbles towards them. Fantastic. Fantastic. Maybe even underutilized in the rest of the series. It still happens often enough, but we don't necessarily see it on screen as much as I would like. Or on the page, I guess. So, I love the way the action is rising in this book. I love the Lanfear and Rand interactions that occur in this. I am such a huge fan of the Aiel culture, and it's not all the big things. Let me break this down a little bit here. So, from a writing perspective, you are creating a new culture. You could just go and do what he did with the Shienarans and kind of paint in broad strokes here. This is what these people do, this is what their purpose is, you get it. And then create a few characters that act appropriately within the confines of that, and you're good. The Aiel go so many steps deeper. We basically just take a deep dive into their culture for a significant part of this book. And that's great. I think that Robert Jordan knew that he had something special with them, and he wanted to focus on it, and we just get to revel in it in this book. We get to enjoy the concept of Xay'atol. We get to see their history and understand how it impacts them. That's a fox. Okay, tonight I've seen a fox, a possum, and a deer on this road. That is crazy. That's trash. That was not an animal at all. We get to see... This one blows me away. If you were to find somebody on the street and ask them to explain to you what dry humor is, I am sure that plenty of people know what dry humor is, but they might be pretty hard-pressed to give you an accurate explanation of it. To understand a culture well enough to not only know what is culturally acceptable or unacceptable for them and how it informs on their society's behavior and decorum, and see that encapsulated in the characters of that culture, to not only go from there, but to also understand their humor, to be able to make jokes that only make sense to readers if they understand later books and have a deeper understanding of this culture. Have that stuff all forethought before you put pen to paper. I think that's incredible. Some of you out there might be going, I don't know what you're talking about. That seems easy. To me, that is mind-blowing. I don't understand how Robert Jordan knew the Aiel as well as he did before he started writing them. And we've been slowly building up to who they are for a couple of books now. And now that we are in the Shadow Rising and we're getting to go to the Aiel Waste and meet these mythical warriors and see the difference, another big motif of the series, see the difference between what other societies believe them to be and who they are, and what the difference is between that reflection of them, where the roots of that come from, and it informs on an entire ethnicity. The Aiel are incredible. To then go even further and get this awesome backstory on what happened 3,000 years prior in the War of Power, simultaneously checking the box for moving the plot forward with He Who Comes with the Dawn, and also checking the box on giving us the Aiel history, which on your second reread or so just hits a totally different way now that you know what it's going to mean to these people, and you've got enough depth and time with the characters that you can understand the kind of suffering it would cause them. That's this book is full of good stuff, and Robert Jordan is again flexing his ability to hone his craft, right? To bring these points together and really show you how character motivation drives his series. I think that there's a microcosm for that in the interaction that Egwene and Rand have when they finally agree that they're not in love with each other, because neither of them believes the other one, and you really quickly get to see both perspectives, where they're thinking about how the other one doesn't really believe it. And it makes me think about that shit. By the way, I've tried to write that. That is ridiculously harder than it sounds. The kind of setup involved in that to make it feel right, to make it feel natural, is immense. Basically, that's what the entirety of Captain America's Civil War is about, right? Is setting that up between Tony and Steve Rogers. And Robert Jordan here did it as a backstory that you didn't even realize was really getting foreshadowed over time. But you get to actually see the characters grow apart and understand why they are where they are. A little heavy-handed in book one, admittedly. But you get to see that, and you get to see it come to a head, and it just feels like an inconsequential part of the story almost. But it's not. It's very relevant. So just another thing that I can appreciate on a reread. I will say the TV show is going to have trouble with this. The trouble is in the subtlety, okay? And it's not just subtlety in that scene, it's subtlety in things like what I was mentioning earlier with the Forsaken being pitted against one another and the storyline's incumbent in that, right? Because if they do something like Lanfear sending a wave of Trollocs, no, it wasn't Lanfear, it was Simmerhog actually that did that, and her Trollocs fought the other Trollocs off, right? And Lanfear kind of feigned that it might have been her, but it wasn't. She was just playing people on that one. If they do that, and they don't explain why that happened until 2-3 seasons later, from the perspective of an uninformed show watcher, that is going to look like them going back a couple seasons later and retconning something that at the time appeared to be a plot hole. And 2-3 seasons later is 2 to 3 years later. So the show can't effectively do things like that in the way that the book did without confusing its own user base and potentially, weakening review scores, making ratings less tenable. There are some issues like that are going to arise for the showrunners that they have to figure out creative ways to overcome. And that one might be simple. It might be enough to have Lanfear hint that she was the one that did it, and then later on you can explain it away. But other things do get less simple. Very much less so. I don't have a great example off the top of my head, but I think you can see where I'm going with that point. Another thing that I want to hit on here, a lot of people say that this is Perrin's book, and I absolutely agree. People also hate Faile for what she does in the earlier parts of this book. I think it is necessary. It's written a little YA still, to be honest. But I think that it was necessary for the two of them to have conflict, and for that conflict to not seem big. They're a new couple, so you don't want it to be anything that could really drive their relationship apart, but it needed to be something that was real enough that it could drive them to some sort of action and not just be ignored. That's a tough line to balance, and all of that had to be there so that you could have the moment hit harder when Perrin finds out that his family's gone. Yeah, that's a heart-wrenching scene right there. I love the way that it is written, and I think that Robert Jordan knew before he wrote it that was going to be a big moment. I think that his setup there is very intentional. People are just such big fans of Loyal that they didn't like what Faile did, but I truly don't. I don't fault that as much as a lot of other readers might, especially not on rereads. She is, after all, quite young. So, this Perrin storyline is basically Seven Samurai, right? And it's great. It is really fantastic. I wish that Slayer was a little more menacing, I guess. I know that he's not supposed to be a perfect heel, but if he were a better manipulator, it would be really handy for the story at this point. Because to us who get to see things from Perrin's perspective, it seems very obvious who Slayer is well before we learn that it's Lord Luke. RJ still had some work to go there, right? He's never been exceptional at hiding his villains, I don't think, but it's not too much of a nitpick. So I like this whole plot line that happens. I like seeing the Emmons Fielders rise up. It does seem to give a different sense of scale from what I envisioned Emmons Field as in the first read through of The Eye of the World, but the Two Rivers as a whole does some really cool stuff in this part of the book series. We get to see the White Cloaks get screwed over, which is great. Dane Bornhold is becoming a drunkard. There's just a lot of neat stuff going on in this area, and it has implications for latter parts of the series. I think that there's also some Pedron Nile stuff going on in this book. Overall, a really cool book. It answers a lot of questions that we readers had from the first book, and it does a lot to set up the plot moving forward, but it also just pays so much off immediately. I think that The Shadow Rising is a fantastic novel, absolutely up in the upper echelons of Wheel of Time books, and that is high praise because they are all pretty much great books. So I would give Shadow Rising a 9.5, and I think that there's so much to talk about in this one that I've just kind of skimmed through just an incomprehensible amount. Rand learning to be a leader, his and Elaine's relationship, the start of things with Barrelane. Barrelane, by the way, is smooth as fuck. The longer you get to read the series, the more you get to like her. By the time I reread this series a few times, I don't even dislike her at the beginning. She's doing exactly what she always does, and it usually works out for her. Hell, it doesn't even fail to work out for her in this one, really. Rand learning leadership, well, he's already kind of learned it. Now he's getting to flex it a little bit more, getting to see what a weasel some of those fucking High Lords are. There's just so much stuff. I am glad that this pretty much ends our travel through the ways, because the ways were getting annoying. And there's a lot that goes on here. I guess one other thing I could mention, if I had to be a little nitpicky, Robert Jordan needed to set up the things that happened with Asmodean and Lanfear, and he knew that he couldn't throw either of them in pretending to be Aiel because of where their plot lines go. So the thing that he does is he throws in this traveling caravan, and it is supposed to be just full of dark friends, right? This is neat, and it's also obvious, and it would have bugged readers on later viewings. So what he does is he drops a lot of hints that you catch on your next read through that Rand is aware the whole time of what's coming, and that he is using it to set a trap. You, of course, by the end get told that it was a trap and that he figured it out, and it helps develop Lanfear's relationship with him a little bit more. It's some cool stuff because RJ knew that, hey, if you can't make this problem go away in the book series, just make it one that the characters are also aware of, and then at least it's an internally consistent problem and no longer an externally inconsistent problem. He does the same thing with Couladin. I'm pretty sure somewhere in there Matt makes a comment to the effect of, how's somebody not killed this guy already? He seems way too high-headed for an Aiel. And Robert Jordan knew that. Robert Jordan knew that Couladin's character stood out like a sore thumb. but he needed someone that represented the Shido. So Couladin had to exist. And to avoid that seeming too kitschy, he throws in that dialogue, and he does a couple things like that, right? So I think that that's a smart way to cover for what would otherwise potentially be problems in this book. And shit, I haven't even mentioned the Aviendha stuff. She's great. You can tell that she's in love with Rand from like basically the first sentence whenever you reread it. Maybe you guys could the first time, I couldn't. It's just, what a cool book, y'all. I love this book. I think that it just nails everything. It's a very exciting series, and this is really the part of it for me. You know, I was interested in The Eye of the World. I got hooked by The Great Hunt. The Dragon Reborn was like a setup novel, and The Shadow Rising. The Shadow Rising is when I knew I had something special and different. And Noah Shamael, which is great, because we had him 3 times already. So now we're getting to expand more, and you get this awesome hook at the end about Asmodean being captured and forced to teach Rand how to utilize the One Power. And you just know the good stuff is coming up. All right, y'all. Next time I'll be back, we'll be talking about, Fires of Heaven. Fires of Heaven, Book 5. Have a great night.